He told me himself the key to his political career is persistence. When he began, Brexit was thought of as a crank issue and UKIP was thought of as a crank party. But he put them both into the mainstream, and his influence has been enormous because Brexit, to which, as I say, I was opposed, is the most consequential foreign policy decision we've made since the war.
Welcome back. It's 12:46. I'm Theo Ashwood. You're listening to Times Radio. And we're going to be discussing now a new book called Making the Weather, 6 Politicians Who Changed Modern Britain by Professor Sir Vernon Bognador. And it focuses on 6 politicians. I'll read them out. Anira Bevan, Enoch Powell, Roy Jenkins, Keith Joseph, Tony Benn, Nigel Farage. All of whom never held high office between them, but all of whom have had a significant impact on the course of this country's political history. And I'm joined, I'm pleased to say, by Professor Vernon now. Thank you very much for coming into the studio. Can I just start by asking you, when you wrote this book, which was your favourite chapter? Which one did you prefer? Which of those 6 was your favourite subject?
Well, I suppose the one I enjoyed most was the chapter on Nigel Farage, though I'm far from sharing most of his political views. For example, I voted strongly against Brexit in the 2016 referendum, but Nigel Farage is the only one of the 6 who's still alive, and although he knows I don't share his views, he was generous enough to give me a long telephone interview of around 20 minutes. So that was extremely interesting, and of course he's still in the political arena, perhaps more so than when I wrote the book, because since I wrote it, he's become a member of Parliament.
What's the secret, do you think, to his longevity? How's he managed to stay relevant? Because he really burst onto the scene with that Brexit referendum, obviously, but before then, UKIP was making the weather politically secure in that referendum, in effect, going back as far as 2012, 2013.
Yes, he told me himself the key to his political career is persistence. When he began, Brexit was thought of as a crank issue and UKIP was thought of as a crank party. But he put them both into the mainstream, and his influence has been enormous because Brexit, to which, as I say, I was opposed, is the most consequential foreign policy decision we've made since the war. And you may argue that without him it would not have happened. And he, I think, is largely responsible for ending the careers of 3 Conservative Prime Ministers, David Cameron, Theresa May, and more recently, Rishi Sunak. He's a much underestimated politician.
What do all of your 6, in terms of personal qualities, when you started analysing those 6, politicians, what do they all have in common?
All 6 are or were contrarians. They reacted against the conventional wisdom of the day. Now, a number of people have asked me, well, why those 6 and not other distinguished politicians like R.A. Butler or Michael Heseltine or Kenneth Clarke or Neil Kinnock? And the reason is that they adapted themselves to the consensus. They adapted their parties to the consensus. These 6 were all contrarians. And I begin the book with a quotation from Bernard Shaw, who says that the reasonable person seeks to adapt himself to the world. The unreasonable person seeks to adapt the world to himself, and therefore all progress comes from unreasonable people. So that's the first thing, they're all contrarians. The second is they were all brilliant communicators. That's obviously very clear with Nigel Farage. Now, whatever you can say about Keir Starmer and Rishi Sunak, no doubt they've got lots of virtues, but I don't think anyone would say that they were brilliant communicators. Farage can reach out to the public, and that, after all, is the first task of a politician. The first task of an academic is to write good books. The first task of a politician is to be able to communicate with the public.
Outside of Nigel Farage, who's the best communicator?
I suppose...
Who wrote the best speeches? Who wrote the most touchstone speeches?
I suppose I would say Anira Bevan, but he communicated more to people who were already on the left, perhaps, rather than the floating voter. Roy Jenkins communicated most to floating voters, I think.
We can hear a bit of Anira Bevan now.
This should be done not at the expense of the poorer members of the community, but of the well-to-do. I refuse to accept the insurance principle. I refuse to accept the principle that the National Health Service should be paid by contributions. I refuse to accept that. I refused to accept it because I thought it was nonsense. If you hadn't fully paid up, you couldn't have a second-class operation because your card wasn't full of stamps, could you? And I wanted, therefore, to use the National Health Service as an instrument for the redistribution of a national income, so that the well-to-do should pay a higher contribution to the service of the sick than the poor.
You were nodding your head during that excerpt of an Aaron Bevan. Why?
Well, I think he made a fundamental point about how he saw the National Health Service. He saw it not just as a health service, but as an instrument of socialism, of redistribution. And that element, he said, was almost as important for him as the health aspect.
There was a bigger vision.
Exactly. And he said that millionaires should be very grateful that their taxes were being used to cure the sick. Now, having said that, we're talking about the world of the late 1940s, when most people on average wages paid very little, if any, income tax. We live in a different world today. That's the important thing. And what was right in the 1940s isn't necessarily right today. And in my opinion, we should be looking carefully at whether the principles laid down so long ago are still relevant in modern times.
What do you mean by that?
Well, is our health service working really well compared, say, with continental health services? I think a lot of people would say that with these very long waiting lists, something is seriously wrong. And it may not be just a lack of funding, because governments, whether Conservative or Labour, have poured huge amounts of money into the health service, but it doesn't seem to be getting that much better. Have we anything to learn, not from the American system, which no one wants, but perhaps from continental systems which are based on different principles?
Do you think that the world today lends itself more to the contrarians that you describe, or do you think it's harder for a breakout star, whether you agree with their politics or not, to suddenly shine amongst the British public? Has too much trust been lost?
Well, I think party discipline is much stronger perhaps than it was, but it's fair to say, and the last election shows that there are many people who don't believe the political system is working for them. Turnout was very low, just under 60%. 2/5 of the country did not vote. The vote for the two major parties was, I think, the lowest it's ever been, and the present government was elected on just 33% of the vote. So I think there is a great gap, if you like, for a contrarian to fill it. Now, a contrarian needn't necessarily be good. A contrarian could be a demagogue. It could be very unpleasant. But I think there are a lot of people who think the political system is not working very well for them.
Can we just move on to perhaps the most controversial name in the list of six, Enoch Powell? We can hear a little bit of what a speech that Mr. Powell gave. Can we hear
it almost passes belief that at this moment, 20 to 30 additional immigrant children are arriving from overseas in Wolverhampton alone every week, and that means 15 or 20 additional families a decade or so hence. Those whom the gods wish to destroy, they first make mad. We must be mad.
That was Enoch Powell. When you started this book, did you put to one side any preconceptions about that you might have had about whether the rights and wrongs of any of these politicians, and just tried to look at it in terms of, you know, what they brought to the political moment that they occupied?
Well, I have been very critical of all of them, and perhaps particularly of Enoch Powell. But it's worth perhaps pointing out first that when Enoch Powell complained about the rate of immigration in the late 1960s, it was around 50,000 net a year. Now it is over 700,000 net a year. And of course, Nigel Farage has built a lot of his political career on the very high level of immigration. However, what Enoch Powell did rather sadly was to prevent us having a rational debate on immigration, because it was linked up in his mind with race, so that anyone who expressed concerns about the level of immigration was tarred with the brush of being a racist. And that has prevented us, I think, from dealing with it very sensibly.
Do you think we're in the same space now?
I think no, not in the same way, because I think we built much more successfully than Enoch Powell would have predicted a broadly happy, multi-racial, multicultural society. There are a lot of blemishes in it, of course, but nevertheless we have been very successful. After all, our last Prime Minister was a Hindu of Asian origin, the Mayor of London is a Muslim, and so on. And I don't think most people really care about that. It's never mentioned in public debate, and I think it would be regarded as wrong to bring that sort of thing up. So we have been quite successful there. What we're talking about is not the racial origins of people coming in, but the very large numbers. And I think that is a serious problem which needs to be dealt with. It's worth pointing out that one of the main arguments used to support Brexit was taking back control over immigration. Now it's over 2.5 times what it was when we were in the European Union. We've got control over immigration, but don't seem to be using it very well.